Welcome to everyone. My name is Paul Grimm. I'm the director of the Bolch Judicial Institute and a very newly retired United States District Judge. I am delighted to welcome you to our lunch program with this exceptional panel of really phenomenal judges from the International Association of Women Judges, or the IAWJ. Yesterday evening, some of us gathered at the Nasher Museum to honor the IAWJ with the 2023 Bolch Prize for the Rule of Law. The IAWJ was particularly recognized for its efforts to support, evacuate, and resettle the 250 Afghan women judges who had served their country during the 20-year effort to establish democracy. When the Taliban retook control of the country in August of 2021, these women judges were targeted by the Taliban for having dared to obtain educations, hold jobs, become judges, and render judgments, sometimes against men and sometimes resulting in the imposition of sentences of imprisonment. Suddenly, their jobs, their talents, their law degrees, everything they had worked for in their lives made them targets of retribution. When no other government, NGO, or organization stepped up to help these women judges, the IAWJ mobilized a team of judges from around the world to help their Afghan members get out of Afghanistan and try to start new lives in new countries. These judges are here today, are the heart of the IAWJ's Afghan Support Committee, and the story they have to tell is nothing short of heroic and amazing. So I'd like to introduce them to you. We have Justice Susan Glazebrook, President of the IAWJ, a Justice of the Supreme Court of New Zealand. Joining us very shortly will be Justice Vanessa Ruiz, immediate past president of the IAWJ and a judge of the District of Columbia Court of Appeals. Judge Patricia Whalen, a retired judge of the Vermont State Courts and a former judge in the War Crimes Chamber of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Justice Mona Lynch of the Nova Scotia Supreme Court. Judge Robin Tupman, Secretary and Treasurer of the IAWJ, and a judge of the District Court of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia, and Judge Susan Bakshi, a former judge from Afghanistan. As you'll note, many of these panelists have traveled quite a long way to be with us here this week, and we thank you so much for being here and sharing your thoughts with our students. One quick housekeeping note. For the safety of our guests, particularly our colleague from Afghanistan, please do not take or share any photos or videos of our program today. Judge Bakshi still has family in Afghanistan who could be targeted by the Taliban if she is recognized. We are recording the program and will post a video afterwards that is edited to protect her identity. With that, I have the great pleasure of turning the spotlight over to Dean Carey Abrams, the James B. Duke and Benjamin N. Duke Dean of the Duke Law School and a distinguished professor of law, who will moderate this discussion. Dean Abrams.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Judge Grimm, and thank you all for attending this event today. I am so pleased to be here to lead a conversation with these remarkable judges. I was able to attend the Bolch Judicial Institute prize event last night, and it beautifully highlighted the work of these judges from around the world who came together to assist their Afghan sisters. Afghanistan women judges endured persecution, discrimination, and violence long before the country fell back under Taliban rule, just for doing their jobs and sitting in judgment of men. And they are now working with incredible dignity and ambition to rebuild their lives and careers in new countries. So let's start with Justice Glazebrook. I thought maybe we could start with some basics. What is the International Association of Women Judges? What exactly do you do?
The International Association of Women Judges, or IAWJ as we call it for short, is an organisation dedicated to the rule of law, gender equality and access to justice. Very easy words to say, but obviously very hard to make sure that they're put into practice throughout the world. We have over 6,000 members from all areas of the judiciary, so including tribunal members right up to Supreme Court judges, Chief Justices, and from over 100 countries and territories around the world. So our main reason for being is to support and empower women judges, especially really through the formation of national women judges associations, because that way in solidarity there's strength. We have education programs that aim for substantive outcomes in accordance with our goal. They are judge-led and country-led, so we're not there telling people what they should be doing. We're there working in country, working out programs that judges want and that are going to make for real change. Over the more than 30 years of its existence, we've had programs to combat gender violence, trafficking and sextortion. That was a word that we coined to indicate the practice of corruption, but where the currency is not money, but sexual favours. And of course that affects women very much more than it affects men. I suppose also to say that we don't just look at programs for judges themselves, but we've also looked at programs relating to the police, to prosecutors, universities, and civil society more generally, and also targeting leaders. So leaders in the community, and especially women leaders, and looking at traditional women leaders, often whose authority had waned under colonialism, and allowing them to and helping them to come back and reclaim that authority. So you'll see that that doesn't really fit in with a major humanitarian effort that we had to undertake in respect of the Afghan judges, but you'll understand, I think, after this panel why we felt compelled to help.
So there was also another program that existed prior to this effort, the Afghan education program that Judge Whalen, you helped create, I think, over a decade ago. Can you talk about why you created that and what that facilitated?
In 2003, I attended an IWJ conference in Washington, D.C., and I met my first Afghan judge, Marzia Bazul. And I was standing in line with her, and I just asked her, what did she need? What could our organization help her with? And she was being offered judicial education, and she thought that that was something very much that the Afghan judges would want. But she was worried that the more sophisticated courts she was being exposed to, and the city courts, were almost too much for the Afghan judges. At that time, there were very few courts that had electricity. They were still using scribes. And she thought the technology of our day would be intimidating. So I said, oh, well, you should come to Vermont. We're pretty basic there. We're in the slow lane. We don't have the complicated dockets that city has or the security issues. And so I took the Amtrak home, and I thought about, what I was thinking about was what was really important to share about our system. And, we use the rule of law, but ultimately the rule of law is about how we want to live, how we want our communities to function. And so I thought it was as important to give them some judicial education as it was to also show them how we lived. So we did a homestay program, and we invited judges to come into our homes. And we also, I have to say, I also thought, if I went to Afghanistan, what would I want to see? And I realized I wouldn't necessarily just want to see their courts. I would want to see their schools, how they live, their, how they interacted as couples, as married couples. I mean, I was curious about it all. So I thought they'd be equally curious. And so, and it just was a wonderful program because the judicial piece was easy. You know, we could teach due process and, you know, basic how our system worked. But showing them our lives, how we made, you know, we were all, I was a very young judge, I had young children at the time. You know, my husband was a lawyer. Okay, your kid gets sick. Who takes the day off? You know, who stays home with the child? How do you work out things? We're in a rural community, the car breaks down. You know, what do you do? How do you get, you know, what neighbor do you call to get a ride to work? So they saw our life in all its complexities. Each night we had a different dinner with women in our community. And we had women in education, women in medicine, women in law, women in politics, women in religion. You know, we all talked about our childhood faiths and how that changed as we got to be adults. And we had a lot of fun. We went bowling, we did yoga. We just were together as women. And I think what happened in that program was that we established a trust that held until 2020. And one of the judges, and we can talk more about this, one of the judges that came on this program, Sakia Harari, was assassinated in the January of that year. And we realized all of the work that we had put in for many years, it was changing, and their needs were changing. The first group of judges came in 2004. It was a project that went on for 10 years in the United States. One of those judges was Judge Hamida Panjshiri, and when she was leaving Vermont, she said to me, you know, if the Taliban come back, will you come and get me? And of course, you know, I said, sure, you know, thinking, well, that's not going to happen. But it did. And Judge Hamida is still in Afghanistan, so our work is not finished.
So it sounds like you had set a really good foundation of trust and relationships before the Taliban came back. I'm sure you all remember watching the news in 2021 as they started to take over the country, and then, you know, finally came to the capital of Kabul on August 15th. It was so chaotic. I remember seeing videos of people trying to get out of the airport. But I don't know if I fully understood the unique threats that women judges were facing during that time. So Judge Ruiz, could you talk a little bit about what threats these women judges were facing because of that takeover?
Yes, well, as you mentioned in your introduction, Dean, it was never easy for the women judges in Afghanistan. They always faced threats and discrimination, but that intensified as the Taliban slowly took over. I don't know whether you remember from the news of the time in 2021, it was a progression from province to province. And in January 2021, as Patty Whalen just mentioned, 2 judges were assassinated. And that was violence of a different nature and intensity than what had preceded. There were 2 levels of threats to the women judges once the Taliban took over completely on August 15th. One was what we can think of as at the macro level, kind of as a matter of policy. They were stripped completely of their positions as judges. They went to bed August 14th as judges. When they woke up, sometimes going to work, sometimes already at work, that was it. They were no longer had those positions, and they no longer had that authority. There was also another level of threat, which was more individualized. And you should know that not only were they stripped of their authority, that means they've received no compensation since then. Some had their bank accounts frozen. Some of these judges were really the main or only source of support for their families. So the economic hardship has really been very, very serious. But the other level of threat was more individualized. As the Taliban swept across the country, province to province, they opened up the prisons. Now, these women judges had convicted and sentenced prisoners. So in addition to the, what I'll call the official threat from the Taliban, there were people who were out just for personal revenge. And they were looking for these judges. Some of them had actually been threatened in open court by defendants as they were being sentenced, as you might hear in a bit. But to give you an example, there was a judge who had ruled in a family case, in a custody dispute, for the child, little girl, to go to the family of the mother. The mother had been killed. The mother had been killed by her husband, the girl's father. I mean, not hard to understand why the judge made that decision. But this man was just enraged by this and was trying to find his daughter because he wanted to take her back. And having been released after he had killed the mother. And so he was looking for the judge, found her, and threatened her, asking her for the location, the address of the mother's family where the child was, so he could go and get her. He asked, actually, that the judge change her ruling. I don't know that she even could have. I don't know that she would have had the authority at the time, but she was not about to do that. And he threatened her. He said, if you do not do this, if you do not disclose to me the location of the mother's family so I can get my daughter back, I will come and kill you and your daughters. So this was a very specific threat she got from someone who was certainly motivated to carry it out and who had identified her. So she went, needless to say, into hiding and had to move from location to location, obscuring her identity as best she could. Sometimes you could go in with some family members or friends, but frankly, after a while, her presence in those families' homes put them at risk, or they felt at risk, and so sometimes they were turned away as well. So it was a very difficult time. And one of the things we tried to do was to find a safe home, safe houses for them to be in Kabul, which, as you can imagine, was itself hard. To find the houses, to keep their locations hidden from people who would do them harm. So those were the intensified threats, and that's one example of the kinds of threats that we're facing.
So given this situation, one might think that states would intervene or NGOs, but that's not what we saw happen. And the IAWJ ended up being the organization that intervened to try to evacuate and successfully evacuated many of these women judges. As I understand it, there were really 3 phases of that effort. So I was wondering, Justice Lynch, could you kind of talk about the first phase? How did the evacuation effort first come about, and what was it looking like during those early days?
Chaos is what is what it looked like. But one of the things that we had done when we met with the Afghan women judges, they had asked us a couple of things. One was to publicize their plight so that the world knew about it. One of the other things that we did was try to collect documents. We were scared that if they were caught with their judge card or their law books, they were burning their law books and they were burning anything that would identify them as a judge. So they were sending us their diplomas and their passports, and we were keeping them all electronically, is what they were sending them, so that if it was taken from them for a further any kind of refugee claim, we would have the threat letters, all of the things that might be necessary for that. So we did that. That was before the Taliban came into Kabul that we started doing that. And as a result of the request for publicity, one of the young judges who is actually going to be here, we hope in May, Tebeya Parsat, gave a number of interviews, and one of them she gave was to a Canadian broadcasting company in French, and that got picked up in Europe. And people then got to know her story, and when Kabul fell, this lovely lawyer from Poland, Anna, got in touch with Tebeya and was able to get her on a flight, a Polish flight, to get out of Kabul when Poland was rescuing their own people. And as a result of that connection, Anna then started offering us other seats on planes. And we then had to try and get the judges through the crush at the airport and through the gates, because there was Taliban checkpoints and there was a crush at the airport that you saw on TV. And of course, we weren't, as Susan said, in the evacuation business. This was not something that we knew how to do. So we started on a 24-hour Zoom meeting, the people here and two others. And we, Susan and Robin, because they're from New Zealand and Australia, were what we call, it's North American centered, but we call that the night shift. And that's when all the flights went. And so they were the ones that were dealing mostly with the flights. We would have to make a list of who was going to go in the seats that we were offered. We had to set up safe houses for people that couldn't wait until in their own home, or they were in so much danger that they had to be somewhere else other than their home. You know, we did things, Patty, it just still blows me away. There was one of the judges, her daughter was diabetic and needed insulin, and they were in hiding in Kabul. And Patty's in Vermont, and somehow Patty got insulin to that little girl in Kabul in hiding. We had to go on things. There was one of the lawyers in Canada set up, she said, Justice Lynch, I'm going to put you on this chat on Signal, and I didn't know what Signal was, and it was called Kabul on the Ground, and it was a bunch of NGOs working to evacuate people. So I was very proud of myself. I set up Signal on my phone, and I got onto the group, and then I asked a question, and as soon as I hadn't hit send on the thing, when I got a call from the lawyer at Warda, and she said, Justice Lynch, what are you doing? You're not supposed to use your real name. So I had to kind of go back and start again. So we were, as you can tell, we were very out of our depth. We had to get them to wipe their phones of any messages with us, because there was checkpoints where their phones would be checked. And then there was the crush at the airport. And so we had seats offered on planes, and we had sometimes to give them a password, or Vanessa had to write some things on their hands that the Polish authorities wanted to see in order to know that they were the people. Some of them had to walk, because of the crush at the airport, they had to walk through sewers with their young children in order to get through to the gate at the airport. And there was one night that I know Susan was she was talking to the people from the State Department when the Allied forces still had controlled the airport, and they were saying, we can see your people, but they have to come forward. We can't go out and get them. And that's how close it was. And some of them didn't make it onto the planes. But there was the young family that did walk through the sewers, and they had a 3-month-old, a 3-year-old, and the couple and the mother. And they got through the Taliban checkpoints, and they got to the gate at the airport, and they said the adults can all come in, but the children didn't have passports. So you have to leave the 3-month-old and the 3-year-old here. And we were able, through Anna and our connections, she said, just wait until that person is no longer on the gate, and the next shift let them in. But That was what we were doing. We were getting calls in the middle of the night saying, pull your people back from the airport. There's a bomb threat, and there was a bomb that went off at one of the gates, as you recall. People walked through went through the airport. They were roughed up, guns put to the heads of some of their family members. Susan, there was one morning I woke up and I was, you'd get up in the middle of the night, or I would, and I would just kind of check in with Susan and Robin, how are things going? And we were up, the next morning I would realize it was like noon the next day by the time you looked at the clock again. And we were on there for 16, 18 or more hours. And there was one day I remember Susan was on her 26th hour on the Zoom call when we were doing this. But I woke up when I was staying in this really small cabin in Cape Breton with no insulation, and I could hear on the Zoom call Susan screaming at the top of her lungs, leave right now. And I went out, I said, what's going on? And one of the judges had gotten a call from this person to say, meet me in this parking lot at whatever time. So Susan called the State Department, who was supposed to be organizing, and said, is this your people? And they said, no, I don't think so. She was trying to get the person to leave from where they were, and the judge responded, say, I have to pack my things. And Susan's yelling at her to leave, and I thought Susan was going to have a heart attack. And then 45 minutes later, we get a call back from the State Department. Oh, that was us. Anyway, it was just mass chaos. We were making lists. We were trying to figure out who, and people, the planes were leaving with empty seats because we couldn't get the people through to the airport. So that was, I guess, a bit of a flavor of what it was like.
I'm just amazed by the thought of you in your houses and cabins and pajamas and on your Zooms and then doing this work. Just astonishing. So there was a first phase. Then what happened? It seemed like there was a lull before the next phase of the evacuation.
Yes, well, I suppose we were incredibly shocked, really, in that first phase because we had very naively thought that here we have women who've lost their jobs, women who were at major risk beforehand, women who'd done so much for the rule of law and for their countries, suddenly in terrible, terrible danger. And we thought we just had to tell people and there would be places on these military flights. That was very naive, and in fact, instead of women and children first, it seemed to us that it was women and children last. So in that first phase, we'd got out very few judges, in fact, and as Mona said, mostly because of this Polish lawyer who single-handedly persuaded the Polish authorities to let people on. But that was about 30 judges and their families out at that stage. And we are talking about quite large families, so it was still quite a big rescue effort. But afterwards, the bomb happened. There were no more evacuation flights. The military had gone. All of the countries had gone. There was nothing left. And we thought, what do we do? And we had these most extraordinary offers from whole piles of people who were doing sort of Indiana Jones type pitches to us for some unbelievable amount of money. We had no way whatsoever of assessing all of this. And so there was quite a long period of a major hiatus until some more realistic prospects and some more some less Indiana Jones type partners emerged, and I think that's the next stage.
So Judge Ruiz, do you want to tell us about the next stage?
Yes, once we kind of cleared the Indiana Jones people off of an incredible number of calls, we still spent a lot of time with these people because we're still just trying to feel our way through this totally unknown, unfamiliar world to us. So there is a lull. There's all the military has been there. There are flights going out, official flights. There's a lot of chaos. There's a lot of attention being paid to what's happening. And then there's nothing. There's nothing. There's There were eventually continuing to be some evacuations. They were primarily for citizens that had not yet been evacuated. And I'm sure you've all heard about the SIVs, people with special immigration visas, who were primarily interpreters and translators, people who had worked for the military, also in different capacity. But interpreters and translators were a big part of that. The women judges, of course, they are judges, they are government officials, so they were not working for the military. They were obviously not working for any foreign government, but they were working alongside and for the purposes that we were there, right? And in fact, what Judge Whalen described as education program and just exchange program that IAWJ conducted for a number of years, and that was done with the backing of the U.S. State Department. This is all financed by the U.S. government. So a lot of effort, a lot of investment had been made in the training, in the education, in the capacity building for women judges and other women leaders in Afghanistan. So to see that there was nothing official going on to assist them and to preserve this resource that was so rich and into whom so much of an investment had been made was really shocking. So we found that we quickly realized it's got to be a volunteer effort. And we were lucky to be able to partner with incredible groups, some of them humanitarian relief groups, but also others who were professional associations like ours. For example, the International Bar Association, Jewish Humanitarian Response, with whom we continue to work today. Open Society Foundation, they were trying to get some of the people that they had in country. And if they had a few empty seats in a spot, then they might make those available for our judges. But at this stage of evacuations, there were several components to kind of put it together. One was the physical means to be evacuated. At that point, it was planes. Finding the planes, this was expensive. It was about $800,000 per plane, depending on the size. You needed a place to land. Landing rights had to be negotiated. We didn't do that, but through partners, those were secured. It was very difficult because obviously the places where people were landing, these countries, and they were primarily the UAE, in Abu Dhabi, Greece, Albania. These places were referred to as lily pad countries because the understanding is that people would be evacuated from Afghanistan and they would be there temporarily. I would now add Pakistan to that list, although there it's not so much flights as people going overland to evacuate from Afghanistan. A third component was documentation. And this was frustrating beyond belief because there was constantly changing requirements that were imposed by the Taliban, whether they were really in good faith or it was a way of preventing people from leaving. Sometimes they were concerned that some people might be kind of trying to sneak out of the country whom they did not wish to leave the country. But the question of who needed passports so that they could leave, assuming we got the planes and there were landing rights, became critical. So who needed the passports? In the beginning it was, well, so long as the head of household has a passport, the family that's clearly associated with that person can fly out. What happened is that the requirements kept getting more and more stringent. Then it was, well, children under 2, let's say, they don't need a passport. But it got to the point where infants needed passports. And so how do you get the passports when the passport office has closed? Because that's what happened. Or even the passport office were open, the judges were reluctant to expose themselves by going there or requesting a passport, or just getting them renewed. I remember there was one case, it was just heartbreaking. A judge had her passport, and it was about to expire, and before the Taliban took over, she sent it in for renewal. When she sent it in for renewal, it got a stamp on it, canceled, pending the issuance of the new passport. Taliban take over, she would have been able to get on a flight. However, her physical passport said canceled. The actual expiration date was still good. It was still valid, but it had this big stamp that said canceled, and her renewal hadn't come out. So it was these kinds of little frustrating things that really made a huge difference in our ability to plan for people to be evacuated as a group. At that point, we were thinking of evacuating people as groups, large groups, and we were successful with some of them. And during this second phase, I think it was about, was it about 100?
130, I think.
130 judges that were able to be evacuated to these several different countries, some going on elsewhere. For example, some judges who went initially to Greece ended up in Brazil, where they still are waiting for their next step. So it was completely different from that first stage. And again, it took the help of many others to successfully evacuate the judges that we were able to evacuate during that time, and that was the bulk of them. And then there is a third stage.
Well, I have a question about money. This is all sounding very expensive. And at least in the US, sitting judges aren't allowed to fundraise. So maybe Judge Tupman, since you're the treasurer, can you tell us where the money came from?
Well, probably not, no. Because we do have some confidentiality issues. But look, just when Mona Lynch said that the organisation in the first stage was a chaos, that's true. And the way the money has been brought together for the evacuations to happen, I've got to say, has been not chaotic so much, but very much piecemeal. And, you know, what you can, you can do, what you can't, you can do. The IWJ, as an organisation, really is not in the evacuation business, nor is it resourced enough to be able to fund the evacuations, as Mona said, I think, or forgotten who said it. Each of the planes is $800,000. We don't have that money. We have membership fees, which are small, and we have specific grants where the money is tied to the purposes of that grant. We don't have that money. And then the question that I was asked, how did we make it happen? Well, we were very lucky to have a lot of really fine people and organisations who were prepared to work with us, because I know in the United States and Canada and the United Kingdom, judges are not allowed to raise funds. It's not quite as tough as that in Australia. We can do fundraising where we can't go off to Coca-Cola and say, you know, can you please fund me because I want to go overseas next year? But we can go to organisations like bar associations and legal organisations and fundraise, and we have done for things like the Afghan Women Judges Support Group. But fine individuals include this woman sitting alongside me here, who is the fundraising queen, and because she is a retired judge, doesn't have the same constraints. Now, she was really good at putting the squeeze on a whole lot of people in the United States and raising an enormous amount of money that went into doing things like providing safe houses for people whilst they were awaiting evacuation. But the really big money, of course, is the logistics of evacuation, and for that, we are very grateful to have been able to partner with a number of NGOs. Now, I know that everyone has said the governments and the NGOs didn't assist. Well, that's not entirely true, because they did. They didn't perhaps assist in the way we would have expected them to, particularly the governments right up front. but they have assisted along the way, and particularly the NGOs. And Vanessa, I think, mentioned the JHR, the Jewish Humanitarian Response Group, with whom we are still working, and they have been absolutely wonderful. And am I allowed to tell them what the rabbi said to you when you asked why they're doing it? Yes, I think I will. Susan?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Because Susan and others, I think, just got this kind of message out of the blue. This has happened. This is, how do we make this happen? Well, we don't really know half the time, except we did an enormous amount of media all over the world. And from that, and the whole purpose was to get people to contact us. And that's exactly what happened with this lovely woman from Poland, the lawyer who helped in the first phase, and the rabbi who is the head of the JHR, who Susan contacted, and they offered to help. And they are still helping, and they're helping in a way I'll tell you about in a moment in terms of money. But Susan asked what I thought was a fairly obvious question of him. Why is it's called the Aleph Institute, why is a Jewish humanitarian response organisation who mainly works in rehabilitating prisoners, ex-prisoners, why are you wanting to help the women judges in Afghanistan, which is a Muslim country after all? And his response, of course, was wonderful. He said, we know what it's like to have a Holocaust. And I thought, well, you can't do a better answer than that. And if they've been just wonderful partners to work with, what we've been able to do, because we're a 501(c)(3) organisation in the United States, and so there are limits on what we can raise and what we can spend money on. But what we've been able to do is to actually channel a fundraising campaign through the JHR. So the money is donated to them. They administer it. That's so that we're sort of hands-off in terms of judges and our organisation. And they're the ones who've been funding the people now who are in Pakistan. They've funded helped to fund so many of the flights that left from Mazar to go to Athens or to go to the UAE from Mazar. We've also worked with the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute, the redoubtable Baroness Helena Kennedy, and they were able to then get funding from fantastic individuals who were able to put together the 2 flights that went to Athens from Mazar. So that's how we got the money. We didn't get the money, but that's how the money was raised, together with individuals. We also had a fundraising thing within the IWJ and raised funds that we were able to use within our limitations. And what we've done is to pay for the interpreter, one of whom is sitting here, who's absolutely fabulous. And we couldn't have done our 24 Zoom without her because she knows many of the judges, Farah, who's here. And so she was there 24/7 as well, being able to translate for those of the judges who are still in Afghanistan who weren't able to speak English. And then they know her, they call her now, even still to this day. But we were able to use the money that we raised to fund that, which really was of great assistance in the evacuation, because when things were starting to go pear-shaped, she was able to talk to them straight away and do it in Farsi or Dari, and that they could understand. I just wanted to say that the fundraising or funding has really got 2 parts. The evacuation is what you were talking about, but because it's getting late and I might not get another chance, the other thing is post-evacuation as well. And a number of our individual national chapters raised funds and kept them within the country so as not to waste money on transfer fees and all that sort of thing. And they're using them now to help the judges who have come. A micro example is in Australia, where we now have 17 judges with 97 people altogether. And my association raised enough money so that we were able to give each of them $5,000. We've got conditions, and the conditions are that they be used for education, but we're doing things like paying for driving lessons for the women, swimming lessons for the children, education costs for the kids. We have school uniform costs for the kids, that sort of thing, so that individual bodies raise funds for post-evacuation. So it probably is a bit more broader than your question wanted, but but I can't tell you the whole story.
That was very comprehensive. Well, maybe we could talk about the 3rd stage of evacuation, which I think we're in, right? So there's still, about 54 judges who are still in Afghanistan, and it's been harder and harder, is my impression, to get people out. So what's the plan now, and what are the challenges and obstacles to?
Well, we had a very dramatic end to our 2nd stage, which we haven't mentioned, we had a failed evacuation flight. There'd been another hiatus where nobody could secure any landing rights, either in Lillipad or for Afghanistan. We were working with another set of partners as well as Jewish Humanitarian Response. We finally thought we had a flight. We had landing rights in Afghanistan. We had agreement that people didn't need passports to go on the flight. We had landing rights, I think in the UAE, I can't remember, or maybe Qatar, but anyway, we had landing rights in the Lillipad agreement. The judges got up in the middle of the night. They had to travel 10 hours to get to Mazar. They got up in the middle of the night. They all got on buses. It was very, very cold and very, very wet. All got on buses, got to the airport, got their boarding passes for the flights. When the Taliban stepped in, stopped the flights, arrested half of the people on the flight, ostensibly because they didn't have passports despite the agreement and the visas we had to move on. Detained half of the flight overnight. Families were split, young children in the terrible cold. They weren't actually badly treated apart from being incredibly cold and only having some water and bread that they were given. But you can imagine with small children. You can also imagine the judges who were left not knowing what was happening to their relatives. We didn't know what happened. None of us went to bed that night. Luckily, they were released the next day, but that was the end of those flights. So again, we had to plan for the next stage. The third stage is really one family at a time. They have to have passports. Sometimes children under 8 don't need them to cross the border. Sometimes they do. Again, that same sort of issue. The passport office closes, then it will suddenly open for 5 minutes. I think it might be open again at the moment, but they've got a huge backlog. So some of our judges are actually getting their passports, but that's because they'd put in their applications and paid for them a long time ago. Some of them are managing to get renewals, but anyway, you have to have that, and then you have to get a Pakistan visa. That is hit and miss. There's an online system. 4 of the applications will come through and the other one won't, and you'll have no idea why. They take ages to come through, so it's very much one family at a time. We've also got this terrible catch-22 for the judges at the moment because there's a new scheme that's been announced for Germany, but you have to be in Afghanistan to be eligible for that scheme. We've no idea how long it's going to take to process any of those things. It's a real scheme. Germany is the one country that has actually continued to evacuate from Afghanistan, but this is a whole new scheme. In order to activate any sort of visa for the United States, they have to be out of Afghanistan. So that terrible catch-22, do I stay for this German scheme that may or may not, do I get out, go to Pakistan for a scheme that the US hasn't yet managed to negotiate with Pakistan to have people in there to even start the long process of security checks, etc., to get through. So we have about 17 judges, I think, are in Pakistan. They're there, they're waiting. Some of them have been able to get visas to Spain through this, one of our unbelievable members of the committee who, she says she just stalks the minister until he finally, until finally the process is working through for Spain. So that's been amazing as well. But it really is difficult at the moment, and in Pakistan, they're finding quite a lot of discrimination against them, but they're also finding that they're getting caught up in searches. And in some instances, there was one sort of very major search operation where I think it was a bit of an entrepreneurial thing with some of the Pakistan police, because they were picking up even people who had valid documentation and saying, well, there's a $100 fine to get your family back. That was stamped on by the higher Pakistan authorities, but very, very disturbing for the people who are in Pakistan. And of course, the people in Afghanistan who are still there without passports, and danger is escalating. It's a very depressing stage to be in. We made a promise to the women judges of Afghanistan that we would leave no one behind. We still intend to try and keep that promise, and we certainly didn't expect it to take this amount of time or to be so difficult, but we do intend to try our absolute best to keep that promise.
I'm feeling so fortunate and privileged to be here listening to all of this, and I'm thinking that all of us are so privileged and fortunate to be safe in our homes and not going through this. I'm wondering what the panelists feel that U.S. and other law students, lawyers, judges should learn from this, should take away from this. Judge Whalen, you look like you might have a thought.
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts. Well, one is, speaking of fundraising, you can buy Ben & Jerry's ice cream because they're a funder of us, so support Ben & Jerry's. And, you know, I think the biggest thing you can do is to remember that, you know, you're not just in a profession. And I imagine how hard it is for many of you with student loans and the prospect of having to pay them back and what kind of job is going to support you and how difficult that is. But I would really ask that you give of yourself somewhere, somehow. One of the lessons that we were working with Afghan judges really didn't have a culture of volunteerism. Our project was a volunteer project right from the beginning. All the work that we do is as volunteers. And you know, it's incredibly rewarding. You know, join organizations, because we couldn't have done this alone. You know, we've done this as a group, and that's been incredibly meaningful. The law is not perfect, as you know. There's a lot of room for improvement. The rabbi that we worked with at Aleph, we talk a lot about this because the genocide statute itself doesn't include gender as a targeted group. So even though the psychological harm that's being rendered to the women in Afghanistan, the judges, you know, their life has been erased. It's been erased from public life. So if you can imagine a lengthy CV of everything they've accomplished, you know, thrown in the fire, you know, it's gone. It's a blank page for them now. And in addition to that, they have to live inside their homes. Their private life is also incredibly restricted. And so the damage that is done to them, we can't even begin to measure that. So what's the crime? What's happening to them? What's the crime? You know, is it a crime against humanity? Is it persecution? To me, it is a form of, because I sat on the Srebrenica trials, and presided over those trials in Bosnia. You know, to me, it is a form of genocide, yet the statute doesn't meet that. So just to remember that there's work out there to be done, you know, in terms of improving our legal system, both nationally and internationally. You know, I don't know what else I can really say to encourage you. I'm so awed by the opportunities that you have, and you may not see them all, but from my perspective, I was telling the folks here last night that when I went to law school, there was no international law. You know, there wasn't even offered. I mean, I went to law school in the dark ages, you know, in the 70s. So, and having sat on an international tribunal for 7 years, I was amazed about how much I learned. And you can continue to learn at every age. I mean, I'm 75, and the things that we've learned this. For example, I now can talk military talk. I don't know how many of you here have had military training, but trust me, none of us did. And we would write these very articulate paragraphs to military people requesting help, and we'd get back, copy that. We'd be like, Wow. And so there's a lot of things you can learn. Trust is one of them. Trust yourself, trust your instincts. I think, one of the things to me that's fascinating about the law is that you're taught so much of the grayness of the law in law school, how you parse that out. But, it's not all that gray. I bet every single one of you here knows the difference between right and wrong. And what happened to the women and judges was just wrong. And our country didn't acknowledge it. They didn't fight for it. They didn't fight for them. But that doesn't mean that you can't. And you're going to see lots of those kinds of issues in your life. And I would just urge you to go for it. I mean, that's what we did. And we're honored to be recognized for that. And I thank you.
Other thoughts?
Can't really follow that up, can you?
No. It's hard to follow.
I would just add, and it just continues on what Patty was saying, is don't let anybody tell you, and don't tell yourself that you can't do something. Because what we've done is not something that we thought we could do. We just did it because we thought we had to, and we found ourselves at that juncture, excuse me. And a lot of what you already know, you can use, and the skills that you have. I've always thought that even though we were working in totally unfamiliar areas and doing things we would have never thought we would be doing, we had certain skills, judicial skills. We knew how to look at evidence, we knew how to parse it, we brought analytical skills to bear, certain organizational skills, networks of people we knew, and then we were just incredibly persistent and shameless about asking for help, about going out there completely beyond our comfort zones. And I think we did that in part because, or I think mostly because, one, we knew it was necessary that somebody step in and do it. And two, because we could bring to bear something that we knew our sister judges who were in such peril and under so much stress could not do for themselves at that time. I always thought of us, we can be the cool heads that they cannot have at this moment. They're getting bombarded with information, with threats, with invitations to show up at places which might be traps. And we're trying to sift through all that, do the best job we can of filtering it and giving them information so that they could make the best informed decisions in an overall chaotic and uncertain situation. So don't sell yourself short ever, and do what needs to be done.
Well, one of the reasons you were all able to do this in this crisis was that you had already been actively working together and working with your Afghan sister judges. And so that's another takeaway for me is don't wait until you're retired to give back. You give back through your whole career, and then you might be in a position at some point to be able to step in a really important way that you haven't anticipated. Well, we're at the end of our hour, but I want to thank our whole panel for being such exemplars of commitment to the rule of law and service to each other and to our world. Please join me in thanking them for sharing their stories with us.
Send money.